In the biggest non-shocker news story related to media bias of the day, the new Knight Foundation Gallup poll found that distrust in mainstream media continues to grow among Americans. This is it. It's called American Views 2020, Trust Media and Democracy. First paragraph here, there is a widening gulf between American aspirations for and assessments of the news media. With each passing benchmark study, the American people render deeper and increasingly polarized judgments about the news media and how well it is fulfilling its role in our democracy. Now, I'm going to scroll down to some of their findings, and we'll start with the executive summary here. It says the vast majority of Americans, 84%, say that in general the news media is critical, 49% or very important, 35% to democracy. So people continue to think that journalism is an important part of how things work here in America. It says Americans are more likely today to say the media's role in democracy is critical, up 5 percentage points since 2017. Then it says that the large majority say it is critical or very important for the news media to provide accurate and fair news reports, 92%, ensure Americans are informed about public affairs, 91%, and hold leaders accountable for their actions, 85%. But more Americans say the media is performing poorly rather than well in accomplishing these goals than they did in 2017. What's interesting about this, and we're going to get into it in a second, is that this is different depending on political party. And I remember reading a Pew Research study not too long ago. I actually have a video that talks about it on my channel, which you can check out. I'll put a link to it in the description, which says that depending on who's in charge in the presidential office and what political party that person is affiliated with, the Democrats versus Republicans will have different views of the news. So right here it says differences in Americans' opinions of the news media are most pronounced by political party affiliation. Almost 3/4 of Republicans, 71%, have a very or somewhat unfavorable opinion of the news media, compared to actually just 22% of Democrats, but 52% of independents. Democrats and Republicans differ greatly in their ratings of the media on every aspect of performance, including providing objective news reports, holding political and business leaders accountable for their actions, and helping Americans stay informed about current affairs. 69% of Americans, including 61% of Democrats, say the increasing number of news sources reporting from a particular point of view is a major problem. In contrast, 77% of Republicans say the same, so they're actually not that divided there. While a majority of Americans across the political spectrum, 80%, say the media is under attack politically, they are divided as to whether those attacks are merited. Whereas 70% of Democrats say the media is under attack and those attacks are not justified, 61% of Republicans say such attacks are justified. Now, you may hear some blame the Republican distrust in the media on President Trump and his Twitter battles with what he calls the lamestream news or fake news, and that he has sort of led by example, and so his base is following suit. I would say, though, even if that is in part true, there is another reason that people who follow President Trump or lean right and are skeptical of liberal bias in the media are even more skeptical under this presidency, and that is because journalists are covering this presidency differently. This is an article from the New York Times in 2016, before Trump was even president, and its title is "Trump is Testing the Norms of Objectivity in Journalism." And if you scroll down, you see, if you're a working journalist and you believe that Donald J. Trump is a demagogue playing to the nation's worst racist and nationalistic tendencies, that he cozies up to anti-American dictators, and that he would be dangerous with control of the United States nuclear codes, how the heck are you supposed to cover him? Because if you believe all those things, you have to throw out the textbook American journalism has been using for the better part of the past half century, if not longer, and approach it in a way you've never approached anything in your career. If you view a Trump presidency as something that's potentially dangerous, then your reporting is going to reflect that. You would move closer than you've ever been to being oppositional. That's uncomfortable and uncharted territory for every mainstream non-opinion journalist I've ever known, and by normal standards, untenable. But the question that everyone is grappling with is, do normal standards apply? And if they don't, what should take their place? The article even goes on to say that balance has been on a vacation since Trump announced his candidacy for presidency, and they say that for the primaries and caucuses that this imbalance actually played to his advantage and gave him $2 billion in free media that was 6 times as much as that of his closest Republican rival. So even before Trump was president, even the New York Times here is saying that he was covered differently, and he has continued to be covered differently throughout his presidency. Going back to an article by the Pew Research Center that is talking about a study that they did, this is January 24th, 2020, titled U.S. Media Polarization and the 2020 Election, A Nation Divided. If you scroll down, you see them talk about that evidence suggests that partisan polarization in the use and trust of media sources has widened in the past 5 years. A comparison to a similar study by the Center of Web-Using U.S. Adults in 2014 finds that Republicans had grown increasingly alienated from most of the more established sources, while Democrats' confidence in them remains stable and in some cases has even strengthened. Now, it turns out that what that article sort of predicted before President Trump was even elected actually came true, and I'm going to direct our attention to the Pew Research Center for more information on that, because they actually did a study about coverage in the early days of President Trump's presidency. So it's called Covering President Trump in a Polarized Media Environment from Pew Research, October 2nd, 2017. If you scroll down past, there's a lot of really good information here, but I'll link it in the description so you can get to it. I'm just going to scroll really fast down to the coverage of his first 100 days. This is the pie chart here. It says stories about Trump's first 100 days were 4 times as likely to carry a negative assessment as a positive one. And it says, basically explaining that when reporting on any event, a reporter can choose a number of ways to orient the storyline, and this classified stories into 2 main frames: the president's leadership and character, or his core ideology and policy agenda, and that overall they found journalists structured their narratives far more around President Trump's leadership and character than his policy agenda, 74% versus 26%. So basically 3/4 of the time it was focused on his character and leadership rather than policy. Then it says what's more, only about 1 in 10 stories, 11%, delivered an overall positive assessment of the administration's words or actions. 4 times as many, 44%, offered a negative assessment, while the remaining 45% were neither positive nor negative. And then it goes on to say something that's been really interesting about the Trump presidency, and that is that his administration played a large role in the stories that ended up getting reported on each day. It says nearly half the time, 45% of all stories, the reporter produced the piece in response to something the president or his staff said or did. So basically that he was driving the news cycle. Now, I don't want to make this totally about President Trump, because I think there are several factors that have gotten us to the point where people don't trust mainstream media. And I just bring your attention to the coverage under this presidency, because I think most journalists would agree, whether they in their private homes vote Republican or Democrat, they would acquiesce to the fact that coverage under this presidential administration has been very different than the way journalists have poised themselves in the past. Perhaps that's also because of the rise and use of social media like Twitter, and I have certainly seen journalists acting differently on social media sites than I saw them in previous administrations, voicing their opinions or their thinly veiled opinions in ways that I had never seen it before. Now, if you think perhaps that President Trump is in fact a unique danger to America and the world, and you agree with this, I will just leave one challenge for you to consider, and that is that if the coverage is overtly negative and overtly critical and aggressive in a way that it never has before, if every headline is the sky is falling, if every headline is this is a historic threat, if every headline is this is a unique danger, then eventually none of it is. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, if there's always a fire, there's never a fire. If everything is terrible, nothing is terrible. If everything's historic, nothing is historic. I think it increases conspiracy theories, paranoia, and frankly, when there is actually an emergency where you need to take the American public by the scruff of the neck and say, hey, listen, like, really, we need to be paying attention to this, you've lost your opportunity, because they become tone deaf, because every headline every single day was an emergency that they needed to pay attention to. And frankly, back to the New York Times article from August 2016, they sort of predict that too, saying that will only serve to worsen their already dim view of the news media. They're talking about core Trump supporters, which initially failed to recognize the power of their grievances and therefore failed to recognize the seriousness of Mr. Trump's candidacy. Now, they go on to say, it may not always seem fair to Mr. Trump or his supporters, but journalism shouldn't measure itself against any one campaign's definition of fairness. It is journalism's job to be true to the readers and viewers and true to the facts in a way way that will stand up to history's judgment. To do anything less would be untenable. So essentially going back to defending their position and covering this differently. Now, I'm all for holding President Trump accountable to his actions and his words. He is the president of the United States and deserves scrutiny. I just think that where the criticism from those who would be considered in these categories of distrusting the media, where they make a fair point is that there are a lot of other people, past, present, and future, who have a significant amount of power and are not held to the same standards of scrutiny. And again, back to the raison d'etre for my channel. I am very open about the fact that I am both a staunch supporter of journalism, but also someone who wants to take responsibility for the failures of the media industry, because I really believe that if we are going to heal the distrust, then we can't just constantly be defending ourselves as if we have done nothing wrong, as if we are totally objective, as if all of the stuff that I have just reported in this video does not exist, that it's somehow America's fault for distrusting journalists and not journalists ourselves taking some of that blame. Now, there is a bright spot if you're still a journalist in mainstream media, and that is local news. And you'll often hear me differentiate between local news and national news on this channel because I was a local news reporter for over a decade. I do have experience working in a national cable newsroom, but the majority of my career was spent in local news. And I do think that the journalists that work in local news, because they're closer to the topics, because they live in the communities they cover, they tend to have a more nuanced understanding of the topics they're covering and take very seriously their role in their communities. And I tend to myself be someone who believes that consuming local news is much more important if you're somebody who wants to know what's going on in your local communities than getting sucked into all of the partisanship in like the national cable news scene. So I would encourage you to check out your local news stations if you haven't yet, or your local newspaper, for instance. This article, going back to the original poll from Gallup and Knight Foundation that we started the video with, says that 31% of Americans say they follow news about issues affecting their local community very closely, an increase from 25% in 2017. However, most Americans are not very confident in their knowledge relating to public affairs in their communities. It says also Americans who follow local news closely are more likely to vote in local elections and to feel attached to their communities. They are less likely to say that, quote, people like me don't have any say in what the government does. The best thing to do as you're consuming news, like I said before, is go with individuals, not brands. But also as you're looking at individuals, are they able to question the establishment? Are they able to question their own side? In a world of very little objectivity at this point, you may still find things useful that people who have a particular bias are saying, but I would be wary of somebody who never questions their side. And I would be more apt to trust somebody who's able to have a detached perspective, even on their own side, and question whether their own side is right or wrong, depending on the case, and is not just constantly running PR for them. Again, I'm Allison Morrow. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon for notifications the next time I upload a video. Give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you liked it or didn't like it, and definitely leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought of it, and if there's anything else you'd like me to cover, definitely let me know. I'll see you next time.